Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Happiness trended as the most searched word on the internet during the pandemic, highlighting the ongoing importance of mental health. As the world battles the ills of disease and war, has the universal desire for happiness changed? What defines happiness? And how do China's human rights efforts impact its society and people's happiness? To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined by Xia Lu, Associate Professor at the School of Marxism Studies at Renmin University of China, Wang Dan, Chief Economist at Hang Seng Bank, China, Zong Ahmad Khan, Research Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization, and Anna Tangen, an independent current affairs commentator. And that's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the show. I will start with you, Wang Dan, probably one by one. How do you define happiness? Is it an individual, sentiment or state, or is there overall standards probably for everybody?
Well, to me, happiness is a state of mind. A lot of people, I think, are mistaking pleasure for happiness. There are different ways in pursuit of happiness. I think the most important determinants would still be the satisfaction from the family life, from the career, from what you do on a daily basis. There might be fluctuations in the short term, but there's a base level for happiness for everyone, I believe.
Zun, what's very important? What are the important factors for you in terms of happiness?
I think I definitely agree with what Dan Wang said, that it is a state of mind at the end of the day. Even in our personal lives, if we're doing better materially, it may not necessarily mean that we are happier. So for me personally, it means obviously personal relations, family, how the career is going. And I think in general, it also maybe for many people, it could also mean a sense of happiness when they feel they have a value to add in their surroundings, in their personal life towards the people they care about, in their career towards what they're working for, their organization, etc. And of course, this is after they're meeting their basic material needs. Then I think it's a sense of how much value you're really adding to your life and to your surroundings.
Anna, do you see people, you are from the US and you have been living in China for many, many years. Do you see people from different cultural background, different traditions, somehow prioritize probably different factors in pursuit of happiness?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember, vividly coming to China for the first time and going to Qinghai province, which is a very, very poor province. And the area, it was bleak. The mountains had basically been eroded, deforested, and people were living a very, very difficult life. But, I stopped and talked to people. And I talked to this one guy. He lived in a house that had no windows. They used blankets for the door and the windows. That area is extremely cold. I talked to this guy and he seemed very, very happy. And I asked him, I said, well, how are things going? And he said, great. And I said, why? He says, well, I used to eat meat once a year at New Year's. Now I have meat once every week. And he says, my children are going to school. And he said life is wonderful. It's looking up. He was very thankful to the local government, etc. On the other hand, I've met I know a fair number of billionaires over the years. A lot of them miserable, absolutely miserable. They're all talking about their next deal and how this isn't going right, and they're really you get the sense that they're dissatisfied, unhappy, that they want more somehow. So I think that gives me the key. At a very basic level, we have to fulfill our needs, and happiness, when you have very little, is just having enough. Once you start becoming middle class, yes, I agree that then it becomes more about your expectations, what you think you need, what status you have, how you interrelate to your family. But that's very, very middle class, and that's where one of the big misunderstandings about China comes from. China came from that time when people ate meat once a year. And this is just, people in Europe and America just say, oh, I can't believe that. But that was the reality. And so, when you start imposing your middle class values, whether you think they're about human rights or necessities and things like that. There's so much of a disconnect between Western culture and what was China. Now, China has quickly become more middle class, but it doesn't encompass everybody. And with the poverty, anti-poverty moves that China has made, the poverty eradication, this is very important, especially to this base layer, right? But it's somehow missed when you start talking to people in Europe and America. They say, "Oh yeah, that's good. I don't know what it means, but yeah, that's good." And they kind of dismiss it because they say, "Oh no, they can't be happy because they don't have, quote, human rights the way we see them. They don't have a ballot box. They can't just scream in the street and carry guns and things like this. Everything is regulated. It's orderly. It's planned." So yeah, very different expectations about what exactly is happiness.
Yeah, it seems there are differences in different societies about what does happiness mean. Professor Xiaolu, you are an expert on China. You have been studying philosophy. So what are the factors to you, in your opinion, to measure happiness, for example, for the Chinese people?
Yes, thank you very much. I totally agree with the previous three commentators' idea about different definition about different definitions on happiness. For example, it is very clear for us to define what is a star, what is a planet, and what is a, let's say, a kind of a stellar system. But a definition like happiness or this kind of definition is difficult for us to define very precisely because it is more of a self-perception. So we have a kind of example to illustrate the feeling. Actually, the definition of happiness is basically on the personal feeling about how you perceive or what kind of interest you can perceive and what kind of interest you have now. So it is this kind of a distance. So your future perception of what you can get compared to what you have now. So if we kind of take the China's railway construction as an example, about more than 110 years ago, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, the founder of the Revolutionary Allies and who overthrew the Qing dynasty and founded the first republic in Asia. And he actually, after became the first president of the Republic of China, after overthrowing the Qing dynasty, he proposed a railway construction for China, for the then China, and he proposed that the China will or would build 10,000 miles within 10 years. But actually, he didn't achieve those goals because we all know that actually until this year or last year, China, the overall, let's say, miles of the Chinese railway, including high-speed railway and the conventional railway, are just 15,000 kilometers, roughly about 10 miles. So, well, it's a very kind of long construction. But back then, when you talk about the ordinary people, well, how you feel your life and how can you travel from Beijing to Shanghai, or how can you travel from Beijing to, like, to Guangzhou, and they would take a very, very long time for them to suffer the travel, the journey. But nowadays, people enjoy traveling, enjoy like taking traveling or taking trip by the train, high-speed railway train. So that would be a basic, let's say, elements influencing or affecting the definition of happiness. That is, how do you feel? How do people feel their current situation and their future perceived, let's say, situation? So this is a kind of more of a subjective understanding and perception. So yes, I agree with previous kind of commentators' idea, like different people and different social group and different society will have different definitions of happiness. But it is more of a self-perception rather than a concrete definition based on some criteria. That's my take.
So it seems like the sense of progress, sense of fulfillment, achievement is important when you compare with what you were, where you were, like in the past decades, for example. Wang Dan, obviously the economic progress plays an important role in people's sense of being happy, happiness. If you look at the numbers from the National Bureau of Statistics, for example, in China, in 2021, the median per capita disposable income of the Chinese residents resident in China was 29,975 yuan, an increase of 8.8% from previous year. So this is the people's income is increasing, the overall GDP is growing. But still looking ahead, like from 2021 to 2025, next 5 years, a 5-year plan, what are the challenges? What are the goals for China probably to move ahead, beyond the poverty alleviation, for example?
Well, the biggest challenge is how we can sustain a relatively high pace of income growth, especially with the challenge of COVID control. It just seems that for many cities, the expectations for property market and for consumption has been fundamentally reversed due to a slowdown in their income and wages. But in the past 20 years, it has been basically the case that everybody in China, their life has been improving tremendously. And people's expectation is still quite positive. And many people still believe if they make enough effort, their life would improve over time. This belief are still there. But when we look at the income inequality, it is widening as well. For many people who knows how to take advantage of the capital market, they make a lot more and a lot faster than the bottom 20% of the population. And then the biggest task for the government is how to redistribute income and make the poorer people enjoy better of this economic pie.
Mm-hmm. Probably that's why there's this, strategic goal of developing common prosperity. And another important factor probably people take into consideration when it comes to happiness is life expectancy, for society. That's a very comprehensive, measure, I would say, because it consists of a variety of factors. For example, back in 1950, the second year after the founding of the People's Republic, the Chinese people's life expectancy stood at 40.45. That's less than 44 years. If you compare it to 2021, it is more than 77 years. So, compare the two numbers, what do you see? It seems like it's not only about economic progress, material progress, probably the overall state of people's living.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we look at those numbers, it doesn't mean that, when you were the people who were living the time when the average age was 42 weren't happy. All right. It was just different conditions. What you've seen is you have personal expectations, and then you have what government does. And the government has been the one that has increased longevity. I mean, the same was true in Tibet, also in Xinjiang. The life expectancy there was even less, 42 years of age, around there. And, people, it wasn't, quote, that they were unhappy. It's just that they did not have fulfilling lives. Their lives were very, very difficult. They might have found happiness in their family or in their religion or whatever it was, but it doesn't mean it. So I don't equate more money with happiness. It really has to do with your expectations and also whether you feel positively about yourself and society. And it's not always, when we talk about happiness, sometimes we tend to think of it in terms of personal terms. Am I happy? All right. But happiness is not something where I can be happy and everyone else can be unhappy. There has to be a balance between the happiness of the individual and the happiness of society. There has to be this sense that society is going forward. Otherwise, you'll feel depressed, right? Even if I seem, I have enough, but I see everyone around me suffering, it's really hard to say, oh yeah, I'm really happy. So, I mean, there is a collective sense, an individual sense, and the collective sense is really driven by planning, by the government, by those who are responsible, the ones who have lengthened people's lives, increased their incomes. But it's not the incomes alone, it's the opportunities that come with them. Education, the ability to spend time with your elderly relatives, take care of your parents, give them what they gave you when you were growing up. These are very, very intangible benefits that have something to do with money in terms of having security, but it is not simply money alone. And I think that is one of the biggest issues that is facing a lot of developed countries, is that people equate money and happiness. And I really don't see it. As I said, I know too many billionaires who are just as miserable as anybody I've ever met.
Yes, Xiaolu, if you look at the numbers, obviously, I mean, the progress in, life expectancy, it's about, multiple factors probably. It's not only about the economic progress, it's about state of mind and the environmental, achievement, better environment, obviously, public safety, security, And of course, if you look at these challenges as mentioned by Wang Dan, the widening gap between the rich and the poor, that could create a sense of frustration if not resolve the problem. And the Chinese government obviously is trying very hard to take care of the people. For example, the goal of common prosperity. So that seems to me it's also about people's sense of happiness.
So I would argue that this kind of difference or the change of the age or change of the life expectancy does not only, imply the expansion or extension of people's life, but also the increase of people's choice, people's option about how their life could be, how their life could become. So if I can only get, for example, 40 years or 50 years, then I should focus on, a lot of, let's say, survivalist or survival, let's say, matters. But if I can, have more time, if I can have more, let's say, free time to spare, then I would focus on more of the, the spiritual expansion or spiritual development. So it can makes me, more happy. It can make me, get me more opportunity and more options to expand my life. To, that is a very, very important, basic supporting of very basic supporting material or supporting definition for the happiness or for people's feeling about happiness. And then, well, I would like to argue that in different period of the socialism of Chinese characteristics, for example, not only the Chinese government focus on economic growth, but also focus on the life expansion or the expansion of people's livelihood or the extension of people's livelihood, get more opportunities, get more options for people so that they can choose what their life can become, so that they can choose what, how much colorful their life could become. So this is, I would like to argue that not only the foundation, not only the achievement that the Chinese government has already, made, but also the future target or the future goal that the Chinese government should also, follow.
Well, one part of probably one factor marrying happiness or not would be the access to quality health service or the government policy in providing the health services to the people. Zoe, if you look at the recent example, for example, the pandemic, what the government has been doing to protect the life of the people, the health of the people. In China, the policy is understood as a dynamic zero infection policy over there. Until recently, is a little bit controversial. People have different ideas because the current the coronavirus is the new variant is very, very contagious. But the previous 2 years is a stunning success. But even now, people would look back and people would say, despite the controversies, despite the restrictions, people would say the idea, the philosophy, or the concept to protect the people's life is critical. It says something about the Chinese government, about the Chinese philosophy in terms of governance. In particular, if you compare, some say if China follows the US model, for example, probably more than 4 million Chinese people would have lost their lives.
100%, Jindo. Actually, I think this point also connects partially with something mentioned by Inar, for instance, the level of money you have. It depends in the end, what are the options available to you. So before we come to the experience here, because these over 2 years, definitely the Chinese government has taken 100% responsibility and facilitated a lot of the COVID protocols. For instance, even when we're taking these daily or 24, 48 hourly tests, the facilities available to residents are absolutely remarkable. So that's something that is being documented worldwide. I think it's something that's helping a lot of people in their day-to-day. And another point is that even if in many developed countries, the issue right at the beginning of COVID was they had the money, they had the financial resources, but there just simply were not any facilities. There wasn't a hospital bed. There weren't enough oxygen masks, or there weren't enough masks to protect them from catching COVID. All of this has been taken care of in China. And yes, for sure, even though there has been, in the beginning, for example, in Shanghai, the way it was executed, people also reacted, people gave feedback, and there was improvement. In Beijing as well, we were able to manage very quickly the fact that we were required to take daily tests, or maybe some of us were working from home. all of that was facilitated in a way to make life convenient for people. And fundamentally, everyone agrees that this dynamic zero COVID policy is better. We are prioritizing saving all lives, and it takes a bit of effort from everyone. And I think over here, another very important factor is how people are being, what is the communication? Are people feeling isolated in this, or are they really feeling like they're part of something together? So another, in 2020, initially when the cases started and we were staying home, this idea that we are together in this, social media became active. Generally, facilities, people were facilitated in universities or through their organizations. If they're facing any isolation or if they're feeling lonely in this, they were able to reach out to professionals as well. So this is at least my experience and the people around me. So in that sense, I think definitely China's zero COVID policy, the way it is executed, it helps people feel less stress. They know that, God forbid, if they do catch COVID, if something happens, they will be taken care of. There are enough resources, and the process of going through that will be taken care of by the government. So I think definitely it's a policy that that has been effective, it's strong, and it's most importantly saving people, helping them feel that they don't have to worry about those things at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Wang Dan, you mentioned earlier about this, the difficulties, challenges in real estate sector, in manufacturing. The Chinese government seems to me they're trying very hard to balance, on one hand, to deal with the COVID, on the other hand, to develop the economy. But sometimes it's difficult job, to achieve, to balance here, obviously. But also you mentioned about the sense of, people, the sense of the can-do spirit, the sense of optimism. How important is that to the future development, to the continuous development of the Chinese economy, Chinese society?
With all the uncertainties, actually hope is the best thing we can have right now. And when we look at how governments around the world deal with COVID and economic recovery, we have to realize that everyone has to work with what they have. And there's a strong constraint of resources. Even for Chinese government with such strong state capacity, we don't lack taxes. China's economy is growing fast enough, even with the COVID lockdown in Shanghai and several big cities, other parts of China. China still managed to grow, but still the cost has been redistributed. Some cities and some individuals are bearing more costs than others. We have to realize that. Like people in Shanghai, people in Beijing, people in Jilin and Yunnan, and they are taking a big hit in order to make other places safer in China. And after the COVID is fully contained, there is a lot more to be done to repair those regional economy, and it's not an easy task. Because it's easier to say that we want to spend more in infrastructure spending, but it's harder to restore the confidence in the market. And the companies need to remake their schedule in hiring. And a lot of them might have to make a difficult decision to contain costs by laying off workers. And that would for sure affect the state of mind of everybody, which in turn would lower many people's happiness.
Mm-hmm. Anna, there's a scholar by the name of Richard Easterlin. He's a pioneer of the economic study of happiness. He basically draws a similar conclusion, as you said. Economic factor is not the measure that will ultimately, contribute to happiness. But when it comes to the Chinese situation, according to his study, there's at least two factors do correlate with the Chinese situation. One is this the employment situation. One is the social safety net. So that seems is really about the sense of safety, sense of secureness. Like, oh, I'm safe in terms of job, in terms of this this social safety network over there. So what's your understanding of this sense of safety in the Chinese society?
Well, I don't think it's just limited to China. I mean, it really is a human factor. If I don't know where my next meal is coming from, and if I believe if I get sick or somebody I love gets sick, they're going to just die because there'll be no care. It's hard to be happy and carefree. you're really just struggling to survive. And Professor Lu Sha, brought that out. I would draw one differentiation from what he said. I said, if you start looking at religion and its growth and decline, you'll discover that when people live shorter lives, religion was much more important because they needed to cling to some sort of hope. All right. And as people started living longer, their hopes were not so much in the afterlife, but in this life. They expected the governments to provide that. So when you start talking about the safety net, when you have a longer life and you're contemplating these things, you expect more services, and that equates, because you cannot be happy unless you're somewhat secure. And that's the base thing. After that, it becomes much more difficult, whether you like this color or that wine or things like that. There are a lot of choices out there, not necessarily going to make you happy, but they are choices.
Well, with that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. We wish you happiness. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thank you for being with us. See you next time.